Today's video is a response to a subscriber, Megan, who says, I would really like to learn more about the accents of different Spanish-speaking countries. I want to learn how to speak like Colombians, because apparently it sounds nice to other Spanish-speaking people. Megan, I would love to do a series of videos on the dialects of different Spanish-speaking countries. But as I think carefully about what you've said here, I feel that there are some important issues that form the basis of your request, and I'd really like to address those issues in this video. I think that not only you, but most Spanish students at your level of proficiency could benefit from this discussion. Here are some of the questions I'd like to address. Who speaks the best Spanish in Latin America? When natives say that certain dialects are better, more correct, or nicer sounding than others, what features of those dialects do they find appealing? Are those features something that students can incorporate into their Spanish? In addition to these topics, we'll address some important facts about Colombian Spanish that you may not have considered. Okay, so who speaks the best Spanish in Latin America? Well, from the point of view of descriptive linguistics, there are no such things as better or worse varieties of a language, just as there are no correct or incorrect clothing styles or objectively right or wrong food preferences. However, just as we native English speakers have our opinions about the English language, how it should be spoken, and which dialects sound best to our ear, so native Spanish speakers have their preferences and opinions. So what do native Spanish speakers have to say about it? Well, it's a very controversial topic with no universal agreement. You can find native speakers whose favorite dialect is Cuban, or Costa Rican, or Peruvian, or any other. And when asked to justify their choice, natives often support their opinions with very reasonable sounding arguments, such as that their preferred dialect is grammatically closer to original colonial Spanish, or that movies are usually dubbed in their favorite dialect, or that a prominent poet or author spoke that dialect. Or maybe they just like the sound of it. Who knows? So is it just a matter of personal preference then? The distribution of dialects that Latin Americans say they prefer is not uniform. Certain dialects are mentioned more frequently than others. What's more, the dialects that are named most often do have phonological and other similarities. This tells us that natives' preferences aren't just random, that on average, they tend to appreciate certain features of the various dialects of their language. Among the reasons why natives say that they like these more frequently mentioned dialects are subtle features in accent that are almost certainly beyond the ability of anyone who isn't a native or near-native Spanish speaker to distinguish or imitate, and subtleties in grammar that are probably beyond the ability of students to apply. Bummer, right? What's the point then? Why bother making this video? Well, there is one commonly mentioned feature of these most frequently preferred dialects that we can discuss in detail, make sense of, and use as a framework for understanding Latin American dialectology on many levels, and use as an organizing principle in developing our own pronunciation, and that feature is neutrality. Some linguists reject the whole concept of neutrality, suggesting that what we call neutral is relative. I disagree with this view. I have my own way of thinking about neutrality that I'm going to share with you right now. Each dialect has features that are diagnostic of that dialect, features that when you hear them you say, hey, this person is from that place. And sometimes we can get even more specific than that, such as, this person is from this ethnic and socioeconomic category from this side of town in this place. Okay, so imagine a woman from Argentina who speaks with very characteristic Argentine pronunciation. And now imagine that she chooses to speak in such a way that she reduces the most prominent features of her dialect, so that they sound more like the equivalent features heard most commonly elsewhere in Latin America. What would her Spanish sound like if she did that? Well, less specifically Argentine, right? And now imagine a man from, say, Cuba, and he chooses to speak in such a way that he reduces the most prominent features of his dialect so that they sound more like the equivalent features heard most commonly outside of Cuba. What would his Spanish sound like? Undoubtedly less Cuban. In fact, it must be the case that our hypothetical Argentine woman and Cuban man would sound more like one another if they each reduced the distinguishing features of their respective dialects. Imagine doing the same with several other dialects of the Spanish language, reducing their most stereotypical features. The result of an exercise like this would be that all of these dialects and varieties would come to sound more like one another. And in an imaginary scenario in which we were capable of continuing to fine-tune each and every feature of every dialect in this fashion, we would eventually arrive at a completely neutral common ground, a center point between all the dialects. So what would that central common ground dialect sound like? it would still sound like perfectly authentic Spanish, wouldn't it? Still obviously Latin American, for sure. You just wouldn't be able to tell where in Latin America it was from. This is my conception of neutral, a hypothetical dialect that possesses the most commonly heard version of any given phonological feature, and nothing that is diagnostic of any particular dialect. This is a somewhat simplified idea of how I envision the concept of neutrality. I recognize that when applied to the real world, this definition of neutral has its imperfections and complications. But I still think it's a useful thought experiment with valid applications, one of them being that native Spanish speakers often mention neutrality when they explain why they appreciate or prefer certain dialects. Now, there are several Latin American dialects that are commonly put forward as being close to neutral. These include dialects in certain parts of Mexico and the Andean highlands, among others. So as to avoid starting a flame war in the comments section, I'm not going to try to produce a list of dialects reputed to be neutral, or rank Spanish dialects by their neutrality, or anything like that. I'll talk about how to identify neutral phonology a little later in this video, and interested students can take that information and evaluate any real-world dialects they're interested in on their own. The one country I do want to talk about is Colombia, because that's the one Megan specifically asked about. Colombia is a large country about twice the size of the state of Texas. It's also the third most populous Spanish-speaking country in the world, behind Mexico and Spain, with a population of about 50 million people. Colombia is an extremely geographically diverse country, with both Caribbean and Pacific coasts, Andean highlands, and Amazon jungle. It's also a very culturally and linguistically diverse nation with around a dozen different Spanish dialects, depending on who you ask. To just give a small idea of the linguistic diversity found in Colombia, the dialects of the Caribbean coast belong to the same family and have similar phonological features as Cuban Spanish, while the dialects of the southern highlands belong to the same family and have similar phonological features as some dialects of Bolivian Spanish. One consequence of this diversity is that different people have different ideas about what Colombian Spanish sounds like. I once had a conversation with someone who told me that she knew what Colombian Spanish sounds like because she had a roommate from Colombia when she was in college. Naturally, what she thinks Colombian Spanish sounds like then depends on where in Colombia her roommate was from. So when non-Colombians refer to Colombian Spanish, which dialects of Colombian Spanish are they talking about? Whether they realize it or not, they're almost certainly referring to the dialects that are most well known outside of Colombia, the varieties spoken in Cundinamarca and Boyacá. While I realize that it's an oversimplification, in this video I'm going to consider all of the Spanish spoken in these two departments as a single dialect. And while I know that native Colombians don't call it this, I'm going to refer to it as the Bogota dialect, or Bogota Spanish. So when Latin Americans say that they like the sound of Colombian Spanish, by which they mean what I'm calling Bogota Spanish, what is it about the dialect they like? Well, it's the two things we mentioned at the beginning of this video. Features in the accent, vocabulary, and grammar that native speakers are capable of observing, but a large majority of non-natives would find too subtle to accurately observe or imitate. This is one of the dialects that is close to neutral in its pronunciation. Here's an important question. Would it be possible for you, an English-speaking student of Spanish, to learn to speak like someone from this part of Colombia? You could, but it would require you to move there for a couple of years and be immersed in that dialect. Assuming it's impractical for you to pick up and move to Colombia right now, is there anything else you could do to begin moving your pronunciation in that direction? Yes. If you were to do a good job learning to speak phonologically neutral Spanish, you wouldn't sound specifically Bogotaese, but you would give your pronunciation one of the things that makes Latin Americans appreciate Bogota Spanish, and you could reasonably expect that they would similarly appreciate your Spanish. So how can you make your Spanish sound like neutral Latin American Spanish? My first recommendation is that you learn the content of the pronunciation videos on this channel as well as you can. Apart from the rules and explanations I provide, the dialect I model in my videos is very close to neutral for Latin America, with slight South American overtones, very much like what you're looking for. As you study Spanish phonetics, don't just generally get your mouth to make sounds that are close enough, but go the extra mile by learning the rules by heart and practicing until you sound as perfect as you're capable of. The fact is that Spanish pronunciation rules just aren't that hard to learn. As I've mentioned at length in one of my other videos, the reason lots of people don't have great pronunciation is simply that they don't work very hard at it. I know that if you put some thought and effort into it, you can totally do it. As you program your brain with a conscious understanding of Spanish phonology, when you hear spoken Spanish, you'll interpret it in the framework of what you've studied. This is also something I mentioned in that video. In other words, your understanding of the rules of phonology will act as a filter that improves how you hear Spanish sounds. Pretty cool. The next step will be to feed your ears with streams of Spanish language content. Be selective about the sources you choose. If you want to learn neutral Spanish, choose neutral Spanish sources. My number one recommendation for students at your level of proficiency who don't live in a Spanish-speaking country is to listen to the Spanish language track of Disney videos produced in the last 25 years or so. Whoever Disney contracts to do the dubbing of their videos does an outstanding job of producing solid, accurate translations performed in neutral Latin American phonology. What's more, you can also turn on the Spanish language subtitles and read along in Spanish as you listen in Spanish. So you get native Spanish-speaking voice actors, male and female, young and old, speaking and singing, and you can read the subtitles while you listen. The content is neutral Latin American Spanish, and the delivery is a normal, natural speed. I can't think of a better source. Truly a goldmine for Spanish students. One side note. The only instance I can remember of a Disney movie employing an obvious regional dialect is in the movie Bolt, where Argentine voice actors play the pigeons. Not only do they speak with an Argentine accent, they conjugate their verbs in voz. Personally, I love this touch. Also, while it's not a regional Spanish accent, Lumiere in Beauty and the Beast speaks Spanish with a French accent. One criticism Disney gets from native Latin American audiences is that the translations sometimes come off a little too neutral. Disney goes out of their way to not use any slang words or regionalisms, and this can make some of their translations a little artificial sounding. There are two very good reasons why you shouldn't worry about this. One, it has to do with vocabulary and word selection, rather than accent and pronunciation. And two, it's something that native Spanish speakers notice in entertainment directed at Spanish-speaking audiences. It's not something for a student of Spanish to worry about. Do I not use enough regional slang? Is my word choice too neutral? The point is that the pronunciation modeled in Disney dubbing is exactly what students of Spanish should try to model their pronunciation after. I know that Disney also produces content specifically for distribution in Spain, dubbed in a neutral accent of Spain, and I'm aware that they sometimes do regional Latin American dialects. For example, I once bought a DVD of the Disney movie Cars that had soundtracks in both neutral Latin American Spanish and regional Mexican Spanish. I've also heard that some of Disney's titles have been dubbed entirely in Argentine Spanish for distribution in Argentina, although I've never seen one of these in person. But if you buy a DVD of a Disney movie with a Spanish language track in the United States, it's virtually guaranteed to be in neutral Latin American Spanish, which is exactly what you're looking for. There's almost unlimited potential here. As a side benefit, the amount of vocabulary you could absorb on dozens of different topics is just huge. Now, of course, there are many other sources of Spanish language media depending on your level of fluency. Audiobooks, YouTube channels, Spanish language television and radio, and many others. Plenty of this content is produced in regional dialects, though, so you'll have to be selective about it in order to find materials in a neutral dialect. But if you're halfway creative, you can probably think of sources that haven't even occurred to me yet. If you want to go beyond neutral Latin American Spanish and try to specifically emulate the Spanish of Bogota and the surrounding areas, you'll probably need to move there and spend some significant time there. Understand that the Bogota dialect belongs to the same family as other dialects in the Andean highlands and sounds similar to varieties found in Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. I learned my Spanish as a teenager in the highlands of Ecuador, the country that borders Colombia on the south, and I feel a pang of nostalgia when I hear the Spanish of Quito, although my all-time favorite dialect is that of the Ecuadorian city of Loja. You could choose to study, live, or work in any one of many places throughout this region and be exposed to similar-sounding, close-to-neutral Spanish dialects. One final note. Most Spanish-language resources we have in the United States reflect a mostly neutral-sounding dialect with Mexican overtones. When I say Spanish-language resources, I'm referring to the grammar and vocabulary of school textbooks, the vocabulary and pronunciation of language learning programs such as Rosetta Stone, dubbed American television shows, Spanish-language audiobooks, and that sort of thing. The reason for this is that Mexico is by far the most populous Spanish-speaking country in the world, and our next-door neighbor, so it makes sense that most of us want to model our Spanish after Mexican Spanish, and producers of Spanish-language entertainment are aiming at the Mexican market. The good news for Spanish students is that this neutral-sounding Spanish with Mexican overtones is very close to what's neutral for Latin America as a whole. So if you also make use of Spanish-language resources with Mexican overtones, it's not going to have an adverse effect on your quest to speak neutral-sounding Spanish. All right, this has been our discussion of lots of things. I do think that in the future I'll do a series of videos on the major dialects of Spanish around the world. I just need more time to decide on the format of that series. If you found this video interesting or useful, please give us a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss out on future content. And as always, if you have any suggestions for future videos, please let me know in the comments.